Okay, welcome to Notes 5.1, The Civil Rights Movement Begins. These are the first set of notes for Unit 5 in our semester. So we're going to look at the early civil rights movement, really what starts the civil rights movement. From here in our later sets of notes, we'll look at some other groups in the civil rights movement as well, but this is just our beginnings. So first we want to look at some of the precursors of the movement, some of the things that come before this big civil rights movement in the mid-1900s. And some of those things include Webb Du Bois, who was in the early 1900s saying that African Americans deserved equal opportunities, better education, voting rights. Then we had the Niagara movement that actually started in 1905 that was working for civil rights. In 1909, the NAACP is founded. And the NAACP is the group that works through the court systems, through legal cases and court cases to try to gain equal rights and civil rights. The Harlem Renaissance we talked about in the 1920s. So jazz and all that culture piece of African Americans becoming a part of our major culture and really making that equality happen. Then in 1936, Jesse Owens is going to win 4 gold medals. And this is also really important because 1936, the Olympics is hosted by Germany. And this is Germany under Hitler, who was pushing for this wonderful Aryan race and his idea that they were going to be the best. And then they're beat by Jesse Owens, a black American. So it really kind of was twofold there, not only helpful to the US, but also helpful in the world. Then in 1947, Jackie Robinson plays his first major league game as a Brooklyn Dodger. So the first man to break the color barrier in Major League Baseball. And in 1948, President Truman desegregated the military. So it was still segregated up until 1948. We talked about this a little bit with the Korean War, that once the Korean War happened, we actually had a desegregated military. So segregated in World War II, and we even talked about some of those different groups, if you remember. So there's the Tuskegee Airmen and things like that. But in 1948, after World War II, Truman desegregated the military. So in the Korean War, we actually have a desegregated military. Now here you see some things like Webb Du Bois, that's him, maybe you recognize his face, the Niagara movement, Harlem Renaissance, Jesse Owens, the NAACP, Truman, ending segregation in the military, and Jackie Robinson desegregating the Dodgers. So some of those things, you can see those, hopefully those visuals will help you a little bit. So segregation changes nationally as time goes on. So we have some national changes in segregation. The big one, and you guys should already know this case, but we want to make sure you remember it, Brown versus Board of Education happens in 1954. The NAACP is the group that takes this case to court. Remember, they were founded in 1909. They are the ones who push for equal rights through court cases. This case overturns Plessy versus Ferguson that was decided in 1898. And in Plessy versus Ferguson, it said that separate but equal was legal. The Brown case in 1954 says that that was wrong and separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. And this is important, inherently unequal and therefore illegal. Separate educational facilities specific to schools and inherently unequal, that means that there is no way to make them equal. If we are separating based on race, it is automatically unequal. And so we see this makes a huge difference, changes segregation, gets rid of segregation in schools, unconstitutional. Some of the schools are even closed because of it. Here's like some of the famous pictures of little Linda Brown with her lawyers going into court. This is a case in Virginia afterwards, and I'll actually show you some of these bigger later. But this is a really big deal at the time. So the courts have gone ahead and done things that the laws weren't doing yet. So that really is important for people. So what does it mean? What does Brown actually mean? So I said it's specific to schools, but it sets in motion a whole bunch of cases regarding segregation in all areas. And so the country was ready for change, the courts started this change, and this change means there are going to be many, many more changes. So this first case that seems like, well, just about schools and this one little girl ends up being a huge change to the country. So we have things like Rosa Parks and the Montgomery bus boycott. We're going to see these happening over time after Brown versus Board. So Rosa Parks is another big one. You've probably heard the story before. I might add in a few things you didn't know before. So first of all, about Rosa Parks. She was actually a secretary for the NAACP. Remember that group that takes court cases about equality to the courts? So she rode the bus to work every day. She sat in the white section of the bus, like you've heard. She wouldn't move when she was asked. She was arrested at the next bus stop. Well, this all is your big story, and you probably heard when you were little she was tired and all of that. That's not why she wouldn't move. The NAACP had planned to challenge the law. And in order to challenge the law and take it to court, you have to have somebody who is being arrested for the law. So they needed somebody who was willing to get arrested and then take the law to court by saying the law was unconstitutional. So Rosa Parks, the secretary for them, was willing to do that. So it was planned. It was not something that she didn't plan. So that's kind of the new piece. So they want to challenge the law saying segregation on buses and other transportation is illegal. And that was why she did it. So what ends up happening after this? The NAACP is in the process of taking this through the courts, and taking things through the courts takes a long time. So in the meantime, it starts the Montgomery bus boycott. So in Montgomery, Alabama, where Rosa Parks was arrested, they decide, the African American community there decides not to ride the buses until the rule is changed. Because the buses could also change their rule. They could make it more lenient. And so here we have some pictures of people. Churches helped by arranging rides for people. They'd take taxis, they'd ride share, all kinds of things. Even people, employers would help. There were all kinds of things that helped them stay off the buses. Because the black ridership of buses in Montgomery, Alabama was 70% of the riders. So they began this campaign to try to stop segregation in transportation. So the idea was if 70% of the riders stop riding the buses, that's going to hurt the company's profits. And if the company's not making money, they have to change their rules to get those riders back. And so this continued until the bus company changed their segregation policy. So it actually changed its segregation policy before the Supreme Court ruled that segregation was illegal in transportation. So the Supreme Court did rule that, but the bus company had changed their rule already because of Rosa Parks and because of the bus boycott in Montgomery. So why is this important? Well, first large-scale example of civil disobedience. So civil disobedience is fighting against it, protesting against it, without hurting anyone. So sit-ins, marches, boycotts, they all fit under civil disobedience. It also demonstrates that something could be done. So African Americans could do something about their lack of rights. They can change it. They have the power to do something. So that's important. Now they feel like they can do something. And this guy you may have heard of at some point, Martin Luther King Jr., was hired as the spokesperson, the group that organized the boycott, the SCLC, or Southern Christian Leadership Conference. He actually is the spokesperson and about the boycott and organizing the boycott. So this is the first time nationally he becomes known. So he had been a small town pastor, goes to Montgomery, gets more and more known, and eventually becomes nationally known as we know him today. So the SCLC, like I said, Martin Luther King ends up one of the leaders there, as well as some other African American clergymen. The SCLC is organized in 1957 around the bus boycott. So that's actually where they start. But they promote the idea of nonviolent protest. So they continue to be a part of the civil rights movement for the next 2 decades, really, or where they're very important in there. And they continue to push for it through nonviolent protest. And this piece down here, very important for them. Their idea was that nonviolent civil disobedience would draw attention to the injustice in the southern states and gain them support. So the idea was, if they are being peaceful protesters and they're being attacked, what's going to show on the news is the unfairness. And so that's really what they're promoting, and they think that's going to gain them support, especially from areas like in the North where there's less racism. Not to say there wasn't any, just there was less. Now, there are some people who oppose the civil rights movement, and one example of that's going to come in Brown versus Board of Education. So this happens. The courts tell the schools that they have 1 year to prepare for this and get ready to integrate, because it's going to take time. We can't do it tomorrow. So they realize they need to come up with a plan, and they give them 1 year to do this. And most schools around the nation integrate or desegregate. Integrate and desegregate mean the same thing. That means to come together, integrate, desegregate, to stop from being apart. But some states are going to resist. And one in particular we're going to look at is Little Rock, Arkansas. So in Arkansas, there is a huge push against this. And this group called the Little Rock Nine become famous for this and integrating Little Rock High School or Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. So the story behind this, Governor Orville Faubus, so he's the governor, wants to get reelected. He wasn't popular. He needed something that would get people on his side. And so many people were against integration. And this high school, Central High School in Little Rock, the capital of Arkansas, was planning to allow 9 black students to attend. So Governor Faubus actually sends out the National Guard to stop the students from entering the school. So it's the day before. He calls up the state militia, the National Guard, and sends them to stop this integration. So he does eventually order the guardsmen away, but mobs remain. They keep the students out. The students are threatened, death threats and things with this. So what ends up happening is President Eisenhower orders the 101st Airborne Division of the military to aid the students and force integration. So he actually sends the military in. The president sends the military in. See, we see in the pictures. The military. And they escort the students to class. Armed military, armed 101st Airborne. Walk these students into the building. They walk them to class. They walk them out of the building. They walk with them in the hallways between classes. So they are there while these students are going to school, because people were so vehemently and violently opposed to integration in the South. And like I said, these kids got death threats and things. So very, very big deal. So we see that people are not supportive in all cases. However, if we notice from this, the national government is being supportive. So the Supreme Court said this, the national government is pushing it. So civil rights is going to lead to division and tension. It already was divisive and there was a lot of tension. So it creates a lot of tension, a lot of difficulties. So we see the Cold War being fought abroad. The Civil Rights War is going to be fought in the U.S. during this time period.